who is the child of the late rocker Greg Allman, will be arraigned on criminal charges in New Hampshire in April.
Cher is one of the most legendary women alive, but behind the glitter and the fame, her son, Elijah Blue, is living a story that is breaking hearts everywhere. Something has gone very wrong, and the people who love him most are watching, helpless. What happened to him? Can he be saved? This is the heartbreaking story of a superstar's son. The present crisis. In April of 2026, Cher filed an emergency legal petition in a Los Angeles court, asking a judge to step in and take control of her son's life before things got any worse. Cher was 79 years old, and her son, Elijah Blue Allman, was 49. But despite his age, he was in no position to look after himself, and the people around him knew it. At the time his mother filed the petition, Elijah was not at home or staying somewhere nearby. He was locked inside a psychiatric hospital in the state of New Hampshire, waiting to face a trial that had come about after 2 separate arrests in the space of just 3 days. His situation had been getting worse for years, with unpaid bills piling up, repeated stays in hotels that ended badly, and a long and serious struggle with substance use that had never been properly dealt with, no matter how many times people had tried to help. Cher had watched all of this happen over a long period of time, and by April of 2026, she had decided that watching was no longer enough. So she went to court and asked for a conservatorship, a legal arrangement that would put someone else in charge of managing Elijah's money and protecting him from himself. It was not the kind of story that either of them would have wanted told in public, but the situation had gone far beyond what could be handled privately, and the courts were now the only option left on the table. What had brought Elijah to this point? And could a legal order actually do what years of personal attempts had failed to do? The petition that shocked Hollywood. On April 15, 2026, a legal document was filed at the Los Angeles County Superior Court, and the story spread quickly across the news because the person who filed it was Cher, and the person it was filed against was her own son. 2 lawyers handled the filing on her behalf, a probate specialist named Justin Gold, and a second lawyer named Gabriel Vadau, who worked at a firm called Loeb and Loeb. And together, they put together a case arguing that Elijah was no longer able to manage his own life or his own money. What Cher was asking the court for was a temporary conservatorship over Elijah's estate, which is a legal arrangement where someone is given official authority to take control of another person's finances and make decisions on their behalf. One thing that got a lot of attention straight away was that Cher did not ask to be put in charge herself. She instead put forward a man named Jason Rubin, a private fiduciary with professional experience in handling the affairs of people who can no longer do it themselves. And that choice was clearly a deliberate one. The reason behind it was not difficult to work out, because a few years earlier, the Britney Spears conservatorship case had played out very publicly and had shown the world how damaging it could be when a parent was placed in direct control of an adult child's life. And Cher's legal team had no intention of walking into the same situation. By putting forward a neutral professional instead of herself, Cher was making it clear that her goal was to protect Elijah rather than to take over his life. And that difference mattered both inside the courtroom and outside it. A hearing was set for April 24th, giving the court just over a week to look at the filing and decide whether the temporary conservatorship would be approved. So everything in the petition needed to be solid and easy to stand behind. Part of what made the legal argument stronger was a California law known as Senate Bill 43, which had recently changed the definition of being gravely disabled to include severe addiction on its own, meaning a person did not also need to have a diagnosed mental illness for the law to apply to them. And that change gave Cher's legal team a much firmer ground to stand on. The hearing was still days away, but the filing alone had already set off a conversation that went far beyond one family's private struggles. The term gravely disabled. When Cher's legal team submitted their petition to the court, they used a specific phrase to describe Elijah's condition, and that phrase was gravely disabled, which is a legal term that carries a lot of weight in the state of California. The petition laid out 3 main areas of concern, the first being Elijah's mental state, which his mother's lawyers described as having seriously deteriorated over time, the second being his finances, which were in a state of complete disorder, and the third being his long and deep dependence on substances, which had been going on for many years and showed no signs of stopping on its own. The document also described Elijah as someone who did not have a clear understanding of money or how to manage it, and who was at serious risk of being taken advantage of by people around him because of that vulnerability, which added another layer to the argument that he needed someone else to step in and take over. What made the legal case particularly strong was a change in California law that had happened not long before the filing, a piece of legislation called Senate Bill 43, which had expanded the definition of gravely disabled to include people suffering from severe addiction, even if they had no other diagnosed mental illness alongside it. Before that law changed, it was much harder to argue that addiction alone was enough to meet the legal threshold, but now it was. And that gave Cher's lawyers a much clearer path through the court process. The picture painted in the petition was of a man who had lost the ability to take care of himself in even the most basic ways, and the court would now have to decide whether the evidence supported that claim. The pattern of collapse. One of the most striking parts of Cher's legal petition was not just a single incident or a single moment in time. It was a pattern, a repeating cycle of behavior that had been going on for years, and that the people around Elijah had watched happen again and again without being able to stop it. The cycle worked in a very simple and very destructive way. Elijah would receive a payment from his trust fund, and instead of using it to cover his basic needs or settle his debts, he would check into a hotel, often an expensive one, and spend the money on heavy substance use until the situation fell apart completely, usually ending in an overdose, a hospitalization, or being thrown out of wherever he was staying. This was not something that had happened once or twice. It was a pattern that had repeated itself enough times that it had become predictable, and the people responsible for managing his trust fund had watched it play out over and over again without having any legal power to interrupt it or redirect the money away from it. The hotel that came up most often in connection with this behavior was the Chateau Marmont in Los Angeles, a well-known and expensive property that has appeared in the background of many celebrity stories over the years, and Elijah's repeated stays there became part of the documented evidence of just how entrenched the cycle had become. What made the situation even harder to deal with was that simply cutting off the money was not something the trustee could legally do. The payments were structured in a way that required them to go out regardless of what Elijah did with them, which meant the cycle had very little to stop it from continuing. Financial and behavioral evidence. When Cher's legal team sat down to build their case, they did not have to look very hard for evidence, because the paper trail that Elijah had left behind him over the years was long, detailed, and very difficult to argue against. The financial picture alone was serious enough to make anyone stop and take notice, because by the time the petition was filed, Elijah owed $200,000 in unpaid taxes, $18,000 to a dealer, and $50,000 in damages to a single Airbnb property, and those were just some of the numbers attached to his name. Beyond that one property, there were 14 additional rental properties that had also been damaged during his stays, and the total cost of that damage added significantly to the already substantial amount of money that he owed to various people and organizations. Hotels told a similar story, because Elijah had been removed or expelled from 18 different hotel properties over a period of time, and in each case the circumstances surrounding his departure were far from straightforward, with staff reporting behavior that made it impossible for him to remain on the premises. There were also reports of aggressive behavior directed at staff members in various locations, incidents where his actions had created fire hazards because of careless cooking, and at least one occasion where he was found unconscious inside a vehicle that was sitting in the middle of moving traffic, which gave some sense of just how dangerous his situation had become, not only to himself, but to others around him. On top of all of that, there was the matter of spousal support, because following his separation from his wife, a court had ordered him to pay $6,500 every month, and those payments had not been made, adding yet another unpaid obligation to a list that was already very long. At one point, the trustee managing Elijah's fund had stepped in and paid out $24,000 on his behalf in an attempt to cover some of what he owed, but even that was not enough to make a serious dent in the overall picture, and the debts continued to grow. Each piece of evidence on its own might have told only part of the story, but when everything was laid out together in a single legal document, the picture that emerged was of someone who had completely lost the ability to function in even the most basic financial and practical sense. The trigger events. While the pattern of behavior outlined in Cher's petition covered many years, it was two specific incidents that happened within days of each other in early 2026 that brought everything to a head and made it impossible for the situation to be managed quietly any longer. The first of those incidents took place on February 27, 2026, at a private school called St. Paul's School. And what happened there was strange enough to make headlines on its own, completely separate from everything else that was already known about Elijah's situation. He arrived at the school presenting himself as a prospective parent, which gave him a reason to be on the grounds and allowed him to move around the campus without immediately raising an alarm. But it did not take long before his behavior made it clear that something was very wrong. While on school grounds, Elijah was seen smoking indoors, which is not permitted in any part of the building, and he was also reported to have approached students directly and engaged in behavior that staff described as harassing, making the young people on campus feel uncomfortable and unsafe in a place where they had every right to feel protected. At some point during the incident, physical contact was made using a cane, and while the exact details of that contact were part of what the court would later need to examine, the fact that it involved students at a school made the situation significantly more serious than it might otherwise have been. When police arrived, Elijah was arrested and faced multiple charges, including assault, trespass, and disorderly conduct. And the combination of those charges painted a picture of someone who had not only lost control of his own life, but was now behaving in ways that put other people at risk as well. The school incident was alarming on its own, but what made it even more significant in the context of Cher's legal case was the timing, because it did not happen in isolation. It happened just days before a second and even more serious incident that would push the situation from concerning to critical. Up until this point, most of what had been documented about Elijah's behavior had taken place in private spaces like hotel rooms and rental properties, away from the general public and away from people who had no connection to him or his family. But that was about to change in a way that would leave very little room for the situation to be explained away or minimized. The next 3 days would bring everything to a point of no return. The break-in. Just 3 days after the incident at St. Paul's School, on March 1st, 2026, police in Windham, New Hampshire received a 911 call reporting a home invasion. And when they arrived at the address, what they found was not what most people would expect from a break-in.
Why he was here in New Hampshire or what he was doing specifically on this street, it's a quiet...
The front door of the property had been forced open, with the frame pried apart using a pair of loppers, which are large cutting tools typically used in gardens, and a section of glass had been shattered in the process, leaving visible damage to the entrance of the home that made it clear the entry had not been peaceful or accidental. When officers entered the property, they found Elijah inside, but he was not hiding. He was not attempting to leave, and he was not behaving like someone who had been caught doing something wrong. He was sitting calmly inside the home, smoking as though he had every right to be there. When questioned by police, Elijah told them that he had permission to be in the property, a claim that the homeowner quickly and firmly denied, making it clear that no such permission had ever been given and that Elijah was not known to them in any way that would have justified his presence inside their home. The charges that followed were significantly more serious than those he had faced just days earlier at the school, because breaking into a private residence carries much heavier legal consequences than trespass or disorderly conduct. And Elijah now faced a charge of burglary alongside a charge of felony criminal mischief relating to the damage caused to the property during the forced entry, which was estimated at around $1,700. There was also a third charge added on top of those two, because by being arrested again so shortly after his previous arrest, Elijah had breached the conditions of the bail that had been set following the school incident, which meant that the legal situation he now found himself in was several layers deep and very difficult to navigate. What made the break-in particularly hard to understand was the calmness with which Elijah was found inside the property, because there was no sign of panic, no attempt to flee, and no apparent awareness that what he had done was a serious criminal act. And that detail alone raised significant questions about his state of mind at the time. 2 arrests in 3 days, in 2 separate states, involving 2 entirely different sets of circumstances, had now made it impossible for anyone to argue that what was happening with Elijah was a minor or isolated problem. Detention and psychiatric transfer. On March 2nd, 2026, just one day after the break-in at the property in Windham, Elijah appeared before a judge at Salem District Court in New Hampshire, and the outcome of that appearance was not a release on bail or a set of conditions that would allow him to go free. It was a decision to hold him without bail entirely, which is a step that courts do not take lightly and that signals a serious level of concern about a person's behavior and the risk they may pose. He was initially taken to the Rockingham County Correctional Facility, which is a standard detention setting, but it became clear fairly quickly that a regular jail environment was not the right place for someone in Elijah's condition, because his mental state was deteriorating in a way that needed specialist attention, rather than simply being managed within a general prison population. As a result, he was transferred out of the correctional facility and into a locked psychiatric hospital, and the purpose of that transfer was specifically to help restore what the legal system calls competency, which is the ability to understand the charges against you and to participate meaningfully in your own legal defense. Because without that, a trial cannot proceed in a fair or legally valid way. The process of restoring competency can take weeks or even months, depending on the individual. And it is not something that can be rushed, which meant that Elijah's situation was not going to be resolved quickly. And the uncertainty of not knowing how long the process would take added another layer of difficulty to an already complicated set of circumstances. While all of this was happening, Cher was not able to visit her son. She was not able to speak with him directly, and she had no way of making contact with him in the way that a parent naturally would want to in a crisis, because the psychiatric setting he was in placed restrictions on that kind of access, leaving her on the outside of a situation she desperately wanted to be part of. That sense of being shut out, of watching from a distance while her son sat in a locked facility hundreds of miles away, was part of what pushed her toward the legal route. Because when every personal avenue is closed off, the courtroom becomes the only door left open. The 2025 overdose. To understand how Elijah ended up in a psychiatric hospital in New Hampshire in early 2026, it helps to go back several months to an incident that took place in the summer of 2025, because that earlier event was, in many ways, the clearest sign yet that his situation had moved into genuinely life-threatening territory. On June 14, 2025, emergency services received a call reporting erratic behavior at a location in Landers, California, a small and fairly remote desert community situated not far from the better-known town of Joshua Tree. And when deputies arrived at the scene, they found Elijah in a critical condition, with substances present and his physical state serious enough to require immediate medical attention. He was transported to a hospital in Joshua Tree, and the fact that he made it there at all was, by any reasonable measure, something close to fortunate, because the condition he was found in was not one that guaranteed a good outcome, and those who knew him were well aware of how close to the edge the situation had come. Cher, upon hearing what had happened, did not wait. She got on a plane and flew out to be with her son, arriving at the hospital and remaining close by during the days that followed, because whatever the complications of their relationship or the difficulties of the years behind them, he was still her child, and she was not going to be somewhere else while his life hung in the balance. Elijah remained in the hospital for just over a week and was discharged on June 22, 2025. But a discharge from hospital after an overdose does not mean that the underlying problem has been dealt with. It means only that the immediate physical danger has passed. And for someone with as long and as serious a history as Elijah had, the days after leaving a hospital can be some of the most vulnerable of all. The overdose in Landers did not change the cycle. It did not prompt a sustained period of recovery or lead to a lasting shift in the pattern of behavior that had been playing out for years. And within months, the situation had escalated again, this time in a way that crossed the line from a personal and family crisis into a matter for the police and the courts. What had happened in the California desert in the summer of 2025 was a warning, and it was one that had not been heeded in time. Marriage, money, and legal pressure. Alongside everything else that was happening in Elijah's life, there was also the matter of his marriage, and the breakdown of that relationship had added a significant financial and legal pressure on top of everything else he was already struggling to manage. Elijah had met a woman named Mariangela King in Germany in 2013, and the relationship had moved quickly from the very beginning because the two of them got engaged and then married within just 6 days of that engagement, which was the kind of decision that left very little room for careful thought or consideration of what the future might look like. For several years, the marriage continued, but by 2020, the relationship had broken down to the point where the two of them separated, and in 2021, divorce proceedings were formally filed, beginning a legal process that would drag on and add yet another complicated thread to an already tangled situation. In August of 2025, a court issued an order requiring Elijah to pay Mariangela $6,500 every month in spousal support. And this was not a small or manageable figure for someone in his financial position, particularly given that his income came almost entirely from a trust fund that paid out a fixed amount on a quarterly basis, and that he had already been spending faster than it came in. The spousal support payments were not being made, and the unpaid amount was growing steadily, sitting alongside the unpaid taxes, the hotel bills, the rental property damages, and every other financial obligation that had been piling up over the years without being dealt with. At one point, the trustee managing Elijah's fund had stepped in to cover some of what he owed, paying out $24,000 on his behalf. But even that significant sum was not enough to make a real difference to the overall picture, and the underlying situation remained exactly as difficult as it had been before the payment was made. There was also a separate and more personal controversy attached to this period, because it was alleged that during an incident at a hotel in 2022, Elijah had been removed from the premises by men who had been hired to do so, and that Cher had been connected to that removal, though she denied any involvement in it, and the full details of what had happened were disputed by those involved. The combination of the failed marriage, the mounting debts, and the growing legal pressure from multiple directions had created a situation that was becoming harder and harder to see a way out of. The inheritance and final stakes. To understand why the April 2026 petition mattered so much, it helps to look at where Elijah's money had been coming from, and why the people around him had felt so unable to do anything about the way he was using it. Elijah's father was Blue Allman, one of the founding members of the Allman Brothers Band, a musician with a career spanning several decades. And when Greg died in 2017, he left behind a trust fund designed to provide for Elijah on a continuing basis. The arrangement was simple. Elijah received $30,000 every 3 months, adding up to $120,000 every year. And while that is a comfortable amount of money, it was nowhere near enough to keep up with the way Elijah was spending, and very little of it was going toward anything stable or useful. Over roughly 6 years, around $1 million had passed through his hands from that trust alone. And when that number is placed alongside the debts, the damaged properties, and the unpaid obligations that had built up over the same period, it becomes clear that the money had done very little to improve his situation, or give him any kind of foundation to build on. What made it even more difficult for those trying to help was that the trustee in charge of the fund had no legal power to stop the payments, even when it was plain to see that the money was doing more harm than good, because the trust had been set up without any clause that would allow the payments to be paused or redirected, no matter what was happening in Elijah's life. The only thing that could change that was a conservatorship, and Cher had tried to obtain one before, because back in 2023 she had filed a previous petition, only for that case to be settled, and then dismissed by the court without a final decision, which in legal terms is called a dismissal without prejudice, meaning the option to try again was still open. The April 2026 filing was the second attempt, and it came at a moment when the legal ground was more solid than it had been the first time around, because Senate Bill 43 had lowered the bar that needed to be cleared, and the events of the months before the filing had produced a level of documented evidence that was hard to look past. The case had also attracted attention beyond the family itself, because legal observers and commentators were watching it closely as the first significant test of how conservatorship law would function following the fallout from the Britney Spears case. And whatever the court decided would carry weight well beyond this one family. 2 hearings were now on the calendar, April 24th for the conservatorship, and May 6th for the spousal support dispute. And sitting alongside both of them was the expected publication of Cher's memoir in May of 2026, which many people believed would fill in the parts of the story that the court documents had left out. At the heart of everything was a contradiction that no legal filing could neatly resolve, because Cher was the person pushing for control of her son's affairs in court. And at the same time, she was privately funding his legal defense through his lawyer, Laura Wasser, which meant she was on both sides of the same argument at once, and only the hearing itself would show what the court made of that.